Today we're going to be looking at two cameras. We're going to be looking at this one, which is a Canon PowerShot SX 220 HS, and we're going to be looking at its predecessor, a 210 camera. The predecessor is a CCD, and this one is a CMOS. So let's take them out of the box. I've got them both in one box, save on space. They both use the same battery and battery charger. The kind of stuff that you get with these cameras. You get sort of USB and some audio and video type cables. You get stuff about the printer, you get obviously warranty sort of instructions and things. So let's start with the 210. What I'm going to do, I'm going to show you each one in turn, and I will talk a little bit about them and what my thoughts are. They're very similar to look at, and the CCD version, that's the 210 on the left here, that actually has more megapixels, but that doesn't really matter really, because you can obviously route these megapixels right down to actually get better images in my view, and also you get better kind of low light handling as well if you can knock down the number of megapixels that you want in your images. So these cameras have sufficient enough detail on their sensors to capture, and so they both have image stabilizer, and they have what looks like the same lens, but I'm not too sure if there's some subtle differences here. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to take this one and we'll have a look at its menu system, and then we'll compare it to the slightly later CMOS version. We'll start by looking at this Canon SX 210 IS, which has the CCD sensor. Interestingly, on the internet, the Canon SX 210 is slightly more pricey, in some cases quite a bit more pricey than the SX 220. That's probably due to the current interest in older CCD cameras. The SX 210 was released in February of 2010. It's not quite at the lower end. The camera fits into the medium segment of the camera market at the time. The image stabilization is one of the selling points. The sensor size is a 1 by 2.3 inch sensor. The ISO is capable of being set from 80 to 1600. The focal length is 28 to 392 mm. Aperture is f3.1 to 5.9. It's got a reasonable widescreen on the back. Not overly fine, but good enough. The maximum shutter speed is 1/3200. The video format is H.264, and it's very capable of handling standard SD cards, HC, HC, MMC, standard USB of USB 2. The weight is 220 grams. It's probably a medium scoring camera, and I would definitely say adjust down the resolution so you're maybe creating smaller files with less noise from the sensor. The lens is probably a little bit soft compared to Panasonic cameras of this era. The 220 came out in 2011, February of 2011, so it was about a year later, and it has the same size sensor, but this time it's a BSI CMOS, so it's a 1 inch by 2.3 inch sensor. The sensor size is 6.17 by 4.55. The ISO starts from 100, so slightly higher than the CCD version, but goes beyond the CCD, goes up to 3200. The focal length is identical. The zoom lens is 28 to 392, and the aperture, the f, is the same, 3.1 to 5.9. The improvements actually are on the screen, so the size of the screen is identical, but it does carry more resolution, so it's a little bit kinder on the eyes. The shutter speed is identical, and the video format is identical. It's H.264. It has the same capabilities for memory cards. It's USB 2 as well. The other difference is the processor. They're very similar. The 210 is a digit processor. It's a digit 4, and the 220 has a digit 4 with IS APS technology. The 220 has more options for autofocus than the 210. The screen is obviously better. The 210 seems to have more flash modes than the 220. And the continuous picture taken is 3.2 frames per second, whereas the CCD camera is 0.7. Exposure compensation is the same. It has the same battery, also the same battery charger. Neither have GPS support, which was a feature on the Panasonic TZ10. So what do I know? The actual 210 is reported to be slightly heavier than the 220. It didn't feel like that when I had them both in each hand at the same time. Looking online for opinions at the time when these cameras were new on the market, some people have remarked that the lens is better on the 220 than the 210, but I would say that's very hard to prove because of the fact that they look identical. More modern in that it's quicker to take pictures when you're taking many pictures together. The files are smaller, but that's not necessarily a good thing. Obviously that can mean a bit more compression. It has been remarked that the processor is faster on the 220. Quite a few people have mentioned that the 210 captures more detail than the CMOS. Again, it's very subjective. My experience of some of the earlier CMOS cameras are that they are more contrasty. They definitely show the light and dark more. The CMOS camera will obviously perform better in lower light than the CCD, but I think you can mitigate that somewhat if you're happier with smaller file sizes and pictures with less resolution in by just turning down the settings on the 210. The 210 has been remarked to be good at a higher ISO than a lot of similar cameras at the time. Basically, it's very subjective. Your best bet is to grab yourself an older CCD camera and just compare it to your CMOS camera. What I mean is you have a lot of CMOS cameras in everything these days, so be fair to your older CCD camera, knock down your resolution on your smartphone, for example, and take your smartphone out with your CCD camera, or maybe take out your CMOS camera as well as your CCD camera, and just take some similar composed shots and really have an experiment. And I think for pleasantness to the eye, CCD cameras were very good. The colours were always pretty good, but you've got to bear in mind that some manufacturers do mess around in the post-processing of the capture. So when the image is being captured, there could be a certain hue or a certain colour may become more prominent. So some of the Fuji cameras can seem quite punchy in their colours, for example, and they actually have modes to make them overly punchy as well. So there's a lot of settings that can be changed in any camera, and just go along and just take pictures when you can. The most important thing is always have your camera with you and be ready for those interesting shots. What is a shame with these zoom cameras is they do seem to suck in some dust, and they can be affected in the elements of the lens, which unfortunately is not a good thing. Now, I will admit that the majority of pictures that I've taken with these two cameras have been with the 220, and a lot of the shots were indoors, and they didn't come out very well. They weren't particularly sharp, and even some of the outdoor shots seemed to have quite a soft, blurred, sort of out of focus look. So I stopped using the camera probably soon after. So I'd used it for a few months, a couple of months. I think it was in the sort of winter time, the autumn. So obviously not the best time to be taking pictures anyway, but definitely not up to the Panasonic cameras of the era, or the ones that were slightly earlier than that. So you can't really go wrong with the TZ7, TZ10 and related cameras. These cameras are basically in the same kind of market as the Panasonic TZ10 and related cameras, the ones that I've actually done some reviews of on my channel. Now, like the Panasonics, they do suffer from dust getting into the zoom lens area, the elements of glass. So depending on where that settles, that could be an issue with taking pictures, because obviously at certain points of focus you may be inadvertently showing up some of the dust and debris stuck inside the actual lens. The lens feel like they're of a reasonable quality until they're kind of fully retracted, and they do feel quite sort of cheap and plasticky. So that's a little bit of a shame there. Now, I've been debating to myself which one's heavier. I mean, they really are very, very close in weight. Obviously, the CMOS one has more features in the menu system, and it has the full HD video mode. That's probably not a big deal these days, because you'd be just buying these cameras for taking regular pictures anyway. Everyone's got a smartphone that's pretty capable of taking video, so you would be probably buying it for the picture taking, and obviously being able to use the really good zoom lens. So I don't think we're quite up in quality as the Panasonics. They're an interesting sort of camera, nevertheless. The sensors, well, the amount of megapixels essentially, they're very close, aren't they? I would be tempted as well, if I just wanted to capture really good kind of shots in fairly, you know, standard UK conditions. It can be a bit murky sometimes. You probably are best ramping down the number of megapixels available. Unfortunately, with the CCD, you do have to take a bit of a hit if you go down below, I think it was 9 megapixels, wasn't it? Whereas with this one, you can go right down to say 6 megapixels, and 6 megapixels is kind of plenty to kind of play with and get some decent shots out of. They both have the same size back screens. Placement of buttons is slightly different on these. So looking at the top, you have on the earlier camera, you've got the actual button to switch on the top, and you've got this kind of little nifty little jogger, which is being replaced by the more kind of traditional one that you'd actually see on the Panasonics as well. In terms of placement of the on and off, I think I definitely prefer the placement on the earlier model. It's much nicer there, and there is a slight difference on this camera, and that's where the microphones are. I just noticed that. So we've got a top speaker here, by the looks of it. On the earlier model, you've got a left and right, kind of right next to it. And I would imagine the microphones on here with these little sort of holes here. So the later model looks better for stereo separation, you know, if you are using it ad hoc for recording videos, whereas this one's obviously more sort of central. The later model has more options in the menu settings, but a lot of the time you're not going to use those anyway. If you're a serious photographer, then you'll probably move into like the manual mode and set everything up yourself. Please like this video. It's very important to like it and to subscribe if you want to watch similar videos in the future. Bye for now.